Hello, this is Mistermath, your chess instructor. In this video, we'll be going over the King's Indian Defense. The King's Indian Defense is a simple, flexible, and powerful opening for black. Similarly to the London system for white, it can be played almost no matter what, and leads to relatively simple and direct plans of attack in the middle game. We'll first review our opening plans before going over two of our possible middle game plans, and ending off on how to defend against our opponent's attacks in the middle game as well. So in the King's Indian Defense, our general aim in the opening is going to be to set up solidly in the center while conceding it at first, but aim to be able to strike back later. So going with this idea, we'll start by moving our d-pawn, not to d5, but to d6 to control e5. So d4, let's say, and now we'll play d6, fighting for control of e5. We'll then develop our knight normally to f6, fighting for control of the center, which is also now backed up by that pawn on d6, helping controlling e5, protecting it from any pawn advances. Since we're blocking our bishop, though, as you'll notice, we'll have to develop it differently. So in the King's Indian Defense, we'll use the maneuver called a phi in shadow, which is moving our g-pawn here up one square, and then we'll be placing the bishop on g7. While this doesn't directly put our bishop in the center, it does place the bishop on the longest possible diagonal on the board for it, which means that it can help fight for that e5 and d4 square in the center. And now that the g8 and f8 squares are clear, we can castle on the king side. Now, at this stage, if you've learned the King's Indian Defense by yourself, or if you were taught it from another source, my suggested final opening move is going to be likely different from what you know, and that move is going to be knight d7. But before I talk about it, let me quickly go over some other options that you might know in this position, and why I believe you should play knight d7 instead of those other options. First, especially if you learned the King's Indian Defense yourself, you might have learned bishop g4. And it looks appealing. After all, shouldn't we develop the bishop before we block it with our knight, right? But the problem is the bishop doesn't really do anything on this square, and it's often going to have to trade for the knight on f3, such as if our opponent plays h6, immediately we're probably going to have to take. Additionally, our bishop ends up being deceptively useful on c8 anyway, which we'll see when we go over middle game concepts. We can also choose to go for a pawn break right now with e5 or c5. We can do that immediately, but pawn moves are going to be the most committal in a position generally, since unlike every other piece, they're not capable of moving backwards. In the King's Indian Defense, we tend to prefer to push e5 if our opponent castles kingside, and we tend to prefer to push c5 if they go queenside. Revealing our push too early on can allow our opponent to adapt more easily to our game plan, and vice versa. Revealing our push later on allows us to more easily adapt to theirs. The third option you may have heard about is knight to c6. Now, let's check your understanding of both general opening principles and the specifics of the King's Indian. Firstly, evaluating strictly based on opening principles. Is knight c6 or knight d7 better? Secondly, if you then add to that evaluation what I just mentioned about bishop g4, e5, and c5, as they pertain to the King's Indian Defense specifically. Is the same move still best, or does something change? This is a bit of a complex question, as will most of the questions during this lecture will be, so please take your time, pause the video to think, and unpause when you're ready. Okay, let's take the problem step by step, starting with opening principles only. The three goals of the opening, which we've mentioned multiple times on this channel, are to A, control the center, B, develop the pieces, and C, get the king to safety. Neither knight move has an impact on king safety, so we'll focus on the other two concepts. In terms of central control, knight c6 wins out. It's going to help control both e5 and d4, whereas knight d7 only controls e5. In terms of piece development, knight c6 also wins out, because knight d7 slows down our piece development by blocking the bishop on c8. Therefore, based on opening principles alone, knight c6 appears to be better. And this is why, if you learned the King's Indian Defense previously, especially if you learned it from some other coach, you may have learned some combination of playing knight c6 and then followed by e5. However, Let's now take into account the concepts I mentioned regarding bishop g5, e5, and c5. With regards to our bishop, recall that our bishop actually wants to stay on c8 and has no need to develop here in this opening, as it's going to be useful in the middle game from the c8 square anyway. This neutralizes the disadvantage that knight d7 would have had in blocking the bishop. With regards to our pawns, recall that we're looking to keep our options flexible and be able to play both c5 and e5. While knight c6 does support e5, it fails to support c5. In fact, it just blocks the pawn entirely, broadcasting to our opponent that we want to play e5 only. Knight d7, on the other hand, still permits our c-pawn to move, and also directly helps contest both the e5 and the c5 square. As a result, once we consider the concepts specific to the king's Indian defense, we find that the situation changes. Knight d7 becomes preferable over knight c6. So now, with those moves done, we're out of our opening and into the middle game. As mentioned earlier, we'll be looking to play e5 if white looks like they'll be castling kingside, and we'll be looking to play c5 if we're seeing that they're planning to castle queenside. In this line, we'll start with castling kingside and playing e5. After this, white can choose to do nothing regarding these two pawns, trade the pawns, or push. If they do nothing, let's say with bishop e3, we'll capture on d4, opening up the diagonal for our bishop. From there, we can develop the rest of our pieces, with a focus on playing to control the dark squares in the position and pressuring the e4 pawn. If white takes on e5, we'll recapture with our knight. Once again, if they do nothing, our bishop's going to have a nice long open diagonal, so instead, they should capture a second time. And after the trade of pieces, we'll be very happy to do so, because we'll have the advantage in fighting the control of the d-file, as well as the fact that our opponent's e2 bishop is quite bad, because it's going to be blocked by their pawn on c4. Meanwhile, since we haven't moved our c-pawn yet, since we've remained flexible in that, we can choose for our next move to be c6 to help fight for control of d5 and b5, locking out our opponent's knight in addition. And if we want, we can also play knight g4 in this position to trade off white's last remaining good piece, which is their bishop on e3. So finally, white's most popular option, as well as the one that's most exciting, is going to be what happens if white plays d5, closing the position. Our game plan will now involve storming the kingside, and we're going to look to accomplish this by pushing our f-pawn. So we'll need to move the f-knight out of the way. But before we do that, we should take this opportunity to assess whether or not we can allow our bishop on c8 to assist in the push of the f-pawn. Often, we can safely play knight c5 first, attacking white's e4 pawn. Since it's only defended once, they must defend. And after they defend it a second time, we can play a5 to prevent b4, making it hard for white to execute their game plan, which is going to be a queenside pawn storm. Note that if the e4 pawn was already protected at the start of this twice, such as let's say if that bishop was on d3, the knight c5 maneuver would not have been possible, since white could have, for example, if the bishop were here, hypothetically, white could have immediately played b4 to kick the knight away, and we wouldn't be able to capture on e4 in response. So if that's the case, if white already has a queen on c2 or a bishop on d3 protecting e4, skip everything I just mentioned and go immediately to the next step, which is going to be, after this sequence of moves, now knight e8 followed by f5. So let's say white continues their plans on the queen side developing, and we play f5. Now, after f5, again, white has the choice to either capture or do nothing. They don't have the choice to push this time. Either way, though, our plan is going to be to push a pawn to f4 and launch a massive kingside attack. Let's start with what happens if our opponent doesn't capture. In that case, we can play f4 and then build up a very simple pawn storm on the kingside. So let's say g5 and h5. If our opponent plays h3 to try and stop us, we can reinforce by moving a knight back to f6. And note that if we hadn't played knight c5, if this knight was still on d7, we would move this knight instead, so that we would open up our bishop. And now we finally get to see why we didn't have to move our bishop on c8. It already has eyes on g4. We never had to move it. It was already capable of seeing it because the bishop is a long-range piece, and it's already assisting this push. It also has the capability to sacrifice on h3 if need be. For example, sometimes if we go bishop d7, queen c8, we can line up a sacrifice on h3. From here on, the attack is pretty simple. We're going to break through on the king side with moves like, let's say, they go here, moves like g4, and we're going to break through this pawn structure here, and we're going to move our heavy pieces over to assist in the attack. Going back, if our opponent captures instead, we won't recapture with the bishop because our plan is still to march a pawn to f4. So we're going to play g takes f5 instead. And then, again, after f4, we can very simply continue the attack by bringing pieces over to the king side. Most notably, we're going to play a rook lift. Rook can go to f6 or to f5, and then it can go to either g6 to make a pin on the g-pawn, or h6 in order to be able to combine with our queen to create a mate threat on h2. White, of course, needs to now find a way to deal with the threat of queen takes h2, and they might attempt to do this with h3, forgetting about a certain aspect of this position. What is white forgetting, and how can we take advantage of it? Make sure to scan the whole board. Take your time, pause if you need to, and unpause when you're ready. Alright, did you notice it? It's the same piece we've talked about not having to move in the King's Indian. It's the bishop on c8. The bishop's long range means that it's already eyeing that pawn on h3 all the way from c8, and now we can play a sacrifice. Bishop takes h3. If white doesn't, if white takes, we now have queen g3 check, not capturing, but queen g3 check. Of course, capturing is also winning, by the way, but queen g3 is even faster. The king has nowhere to run but to the left, and now rook takes h3 is going to be checkmate. And if white doesn't take, our bishop can continue its rampage. So let's say white moves the rook over. We can play bishop captures g2, and we can completely open up white's king, and the bishop still can't be taken because let's say king takes g2, and now there's going to be queen g3, and once the king retreats, there's rook h1 checkmate. Nice job if you spotted it. So that was everything on how to attack the king side. However, as we mentioned earlier, we can also attack on the queen side if white castles queenside. So now let's take a look at that side of the board. In this example, white has decided to put a pawn on f3 instead of a knight, and in doing so, they've opted also to develop their queenside first. That signals that they're going to castle queenside, so instead of playing e5, we're going to play the other pawn push, which is c5. Again, white has three options. They can do nothing, they can trade, or they can push. If they do nothing, we'll take on d4 to open up this diagonal, and then we'll develop and prepare a queenside attack, the plans for which I'll go over in just a moment. If they trade, we'll take with the pawn, and again, we're going to develop and prepare a queenside attack, the plans for which I'll go over in just a second. And finally, if they push, we'll again develop and prepare a queenside attack. So let's go into that now. The queenside attack plan centers around playing for the b5 push. So logically, no matter what, we're going to have to start with h6, or a6 rather, to protect b5. After that though, we have two options. The first is to prepare b5 slowly but securely. That's going to be with moves like queen a5, rook b8, and moving the knight out to play bishop d7. This way, b5 is more thoroughly protected before we push. This allows for more of a slow pawn build-up on the queen side, which we can use to sort of roll over white's defense. Our second option is going to be to play b5 immediately after a6. And this is going to, if white has a pawn on c4, it's going to lose a pawn. Because after we take, a takes, white can't take with the knight because the a2 pawn would be hanging since this is now open, but of course they can take with the bishop. And now this will lose a pawn, but it's going to be far quicker, right? We immediately open the lines. This option allows us to now use these open lines and leverage them with our queen and rook. So let's say queen a5. And in this version, this bishop is kind of annoying because it's blocking this b file. So we'll use bishop a6 to try and trade it off. You may have noticed here that white doesn't look like they're forced to trade the bishop. And they actually have two ways of declining the trade. Of course, they can't go backwards, but they can go to bishop a4 or to c6. However, both methods of declining the trade end up actually losing quite badly for white. Bishop a4 is bad for the relatively more obvious reason that it's not going to stop us from continuing our pressure since it no longer blocks the b file. It also ties up white's pieces because the knight is now forced to defend the bishop, and we can simply continue our development on the queen side. Bishop c6, though, is bad for less obvious reasons. While, of course, we can just move the rook, and we'll still have a very strong attack, there's a second, less obvious, but equally powerful way to continue the attack instead. Can you see what the idea is? Now, the lines resulting from this move are going to be very complicated, so I don't suggest trying to use brute calculation to solve this puzzle. Instead, think about our pieces, our game plan, and how we can move towards that game plan as quickly as possible. If you're a beginner, just try to find the next move and understand the general concepts behind it. If you're more advanced, try to challenge yourself by finding our next 3 moves. This is going to be a very tough one, but again, the first move will be easiest to find if you focus more on concepts rather than pure calculation. So, how can we best continue the attack? Pause the video, take your time, and unpause when you're ready. Okay, so if we aren't saving the rook, we'll gain 1 turn, or 1 tempo as it's called, since our opponent will spend a turn capturing the rook. Therefore, we'll effectively have 2 turns in a row here. With that in mind, we have 2 questions to answer. What weaknesses can we take advantage of in our opponent's position? And what pieces of ours can we activate to do so? The most striking thing about this position is going to be the power of our bishops. Our bishops on a6 and g7 cut through our opponent's squares like a laser. Let's first focus on the a6 f1 diagonal. Since our opponent's bishop just left that diagonal, we now have total control over it. And the only piece we can use to try and take advantage of that square is going to be our d7 knight. Our other squares are either too far away or are blocked by the central pawns. But our d7 knight, because it can hop over them, is going to be able to maneuver to the critical d3 and c4 square in just 2 turns with knight e5. From there, it'll fork our opponent's defenders. Now, if you're a beginner, you can stop here and skip if you'd like. The general concept to remember is that during an attack, it's often worth it to sacrifice pieces to get a chance to coordinate our other pieces and make tactical threats. Now, those who went further or want to see more analysis, let's do that now. While knight d3 check is going to be tempting, just because it's check, after our opponent moves their king, we're not going to have too much better here than just recovering the bishop. There's really no threat for us to immediately capitalize on. So what's really interesting is knight c4, forking the queen, the bishop, and the pawn. And you might be thinking, okay, well, I understand that attacking the queen's going to matter, but it's just going to move, right? And why does attacking the pawn or the bishop matter? Well, and that's because of the other diagonal we mentioned, the bishop on g7. It's ready right there behind our knight, ready to unleash a discovered attack on our opponent's knight on c3, and that means our opponent actually has no defensive options. So let's take it slow and analyze this position again. The queen is attacked, the pawn is attacked, the queen is attacked, the pawn is attacked, the bishop is attacked, and our bishop is ready to attack the knight on c3. If our opponent defends the pawn and the knight, but not the bishop, then we simply capture the bishop, fork their queen and their rook, and we'll be winning material. If our opponent defends the bishop and the knight but not the pawn, then we can sacrifice on the pawn we can force our opponent's king out with knight takes b2. And then, once the king is out, we can unleash the rest of our pieces and utilize this diagonal. Knight captures e4, and now the white king is very, very, uh, very doomed. So, for example, f takes e4, rook b8 brings our final piece into the attack, king a1, bishop captures on c3, queen captures c3, and queen captures c3, and this is checkmate. And finally, if white defends the bishop and the pawn, but not the knight, with a move like queen f2, we can again play knight captures e4, unleashing that bishop to attack the knight. White's knight is also pinned to the pawn on b2, since our c4 knight is still attacking that. And if white plays f takes e4 to not break the pin, our pieces can all still activate. For example, bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, queen takes c3, and all of our pieces are ready to finish this attack. For example, queen c2, queen a3 check, king b1, rook b8, and white again is going to get mated very quickly here. So there are too many individual lines to go over all of them here. But again, the general concept is that our queenside attack can be extremely, extremely explosive if you find the right ideas. And instead of trying to do individual calculations, I strongly recommend looking for ways to bring all of your pieces into the attack as explosively as possible, using all of their strengths to open lines, and then exploit those lines at any cost in terms of material. So with all that talk about attacking, you may be wondering, where's the defense in the King's Indian defense? And that part comes now. So we've discussed our opening and both of our middle game attacking plans, one on the king side and the other on the queen side. But of course, white isn't going to sit there and take it, and they have ways to try and disrupt us in all three of the parts we've discussed so far. So we'll be rounding out this video by discussing how to defend against white's most notable plans. Firstly, while our opening setup is going to stay the same in almost every instance, there is one way for white to try and shake things up, and that's by playing e5 early. In general, we have two options. We can trade and then advance the knight, or we can retreat. In general, trading tends to be better the earlier e5 is played, and retreating tends to be better the later e5 is played. Here, for example, we can win a pawn by taking on e5, trading the queens, and then playing knight g4, which forks to f2 and e5 pawns. If white plays e5 at a later time though, let's say here, trading isn't very good anymore, since if we take, they take, and we try to do the same thing, after knight g4, we're no longer really forking anything. And we've only helped them develop their rook, which means that now our opponent can counterattack with knight d5, and that actually attacks our c7 pawn, and that's kind of unstoppable. We can't defend it with our knight because they're going to take, and we obviously don't want to move our king into a discovered attack. So instead, going back, we should just retreat with the knight here instead, with knight d7. And now later, after some more developments, we can begin a counterattack with, let's say, c5, utilize this pin on the d4 pawn, and we can start to break down the center that is overextended. Now that we're familiar with how to answer white's main attempt to disrupt us in the opening, we can talk about the middle game. White's general game plan is going to be to attack on the opposite side of the board as us. So when we go on the king side, for example, they'll go on the queen side, and vice versa, of course. So let's start with the queenside attack first. On the queen side, white is going to want to play b4 and c5. So the maneuver we mentioned earlier in our kingside attack segment, which was knight c5, followed by a5, is going to be very effective in heavily slowing down b4. If we want to, we can also throw in b6, but usually that won't be necessary. Slowing down b4 alone buys enough time. Now, once your opponent does get to play b4, say here, we'll simply capture, and then retreat with the knight. And when they play c5, let's say they'll go knight b3 to support c5, we'll simply ignore them. And now they have two options. They can push, in which case we'll capture, and move the knight to b6 to cover d5 and make sure they can't infiltrate. Or, if they capture on d6, we'll recapture with the pawn. And either way, we set up a sort of wall-like structure in the center. Here, we see the defensive resourcefulness of our knight on e8, as even though it doesn't directly help in the attack right now, it does help defending in terms of guarding d6 and preventing any invasion on c7 by our opponent's rook or queen in the future. If we need to further guard c7, we can also move the rook up to f7, and then moving the knight out to f6, which also has the benefit, of course, of unleashing our c8 bishop. If we're worried about d6 at any time, such as if our opponent tries something like knight b5, we can also play bishop f8 to further defend that. And that also has the nice side effect of also allowing our rook to slide over to g7 or h7 to help with the kingside attack as well. Similarly, our bishop on c8 also does a great job of both attacking and defending, as it both supports the g4 push, as mentioned earlier, and is also one of the only defenders of the b7 pawn. And additionally, it also does a great job of contesting white's bishop, should it ever move to b5. Finally, we'll go over how to defend the kingside attack, which is going to happen when we try to attack on the queenside. Firstly, if white leads off the attack by pushing pawns, instead of by trying to trade our bishop, we should immediately play h5, with the idea of blocking white's pawns. Now, after we play h5, which looks like it locks down g4, white may attempt to play g4 anyway. Now, the question here is simple. Should we take, or should we not take? I'd suggest trying to recall some of the ideas we went over in the previous puzzle, and perhaps trying to think about the position from white's perspective. Would you prefer for black to take, or would you prefer for black to not take? Again, pause the video, take your time, and unpause when you're ready. Alright, let's first see what happens if we take. This looks natural. After all, the pawn was attacked more times than it was defended, right? It was attacked twice and defended once. However, what's more important here is the attack on the king side, and taking here is a positional error. The purpose of playing h5 was to block off white's pawns from advancing, but by taking on g4, we open up their attack for them. White can now use the idea we discussed in the previous puzzle, that it's often worth it to sacrifice materials to open lines and activate pieces, and play h5, completely ignoring our pawn on g4. They're just going to try and battering ram through. Now, we're going to have to play very carefully to make sure that we don't get checkmated, and it's very easy to mess up. For example, g captures h5, bishop h6, and we're already in a lot of trouble. White is threatening checkmate in 2 with queen g5 and queen g7. So with that in mind, knowing that we should not open lines, our best option is going to be not to take and simply progress with our attacking plans instead with a move like b5 or something like rook b8. And here, we see that white doesn't actually have a way to progress. If they go g5 and push the pawn, we can simply move the knight out, and the kingside is going to be locked. If they capture, we'll take with the knight, not with the pawn, because taking with the pawn would open a line, but with the knight, and we'll see that this kingside structure, again, is very blocked. So good job if you came to that conclusion, that we should not take, and we should just continue with our attack instead. So going back, since white needs to stop h5, they should lead off not with h4, but with bishop h6, attempting to block our pawn and later on trade our bishop. And our policy on the king side is not going to be able to do anything. When white puts a piece in front of our pieces, generally speaking, we shouldn't take it because it's going to open up our opponent's options. Instead, we're just going to sit tight, and we're just going to continue our queenside plans until we're threatened. So let's say rook b8, right? And we'll continue expanding on the queenside here at b4, and we'll just continue our plans. just continuing to advance on this side of the board. Only after white starts capturing should we now respond. So let's say they try to trade bishops, of course we have to take that back. Let's say they take our pawn, of course we have to take that back. Notably, of course, we have to recapture on g6 with the f pawn. If we take with the h pawn, there's going to be checkmate in 2, and we're just going to lose the game. So of course, we need to capture with the f pawn. Then our opponent's probably going to check us anyway, and when we retreat our king, our knight is now defending h7 and preventing checkmate, so they're probably going to play g5, trying to remove our defender. But of course, we'll play knight h5 to clog up and break this battery between their queen and their rook. And in doing so, we also trap their queen. Now, besides continuing our attack on the queen side, we have other defensive ideas, and those include, for example, playing rook f7 and knight f8 to very firmly secure h7, as well as playing knight e5 to open up our bishop and potentially trap white's queen with knight f7. And with that, that's everything you need to know about the King's Indian defense. To recap, we went over the opening setup of the King's Indian, attacking ideas on both sides of the board, both the king side and the queen side for black, and how to defend against all of white's attempts to counterattack or to disrupt us. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and feel free to leave any comments if you have questions about the opening. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next video.